Welcome to Women Entrepreneurs Radio with your host, Deborah Bailey. When I started this podcast in 2008, I was on a mission to promote women business owners, creatives, and entrepreneurs. In each episode, my guests provide resources, valuable tips, and inspiration. Women Entrepreneurs Radio is about showing women how to harness their natural strength to achieve success on their own terms. Did you know that you can find the Women Entrepreneurs Radio podcast on many podcast platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, Spotify, and YouTube also? If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please take a moment to share your feedback and a review. 5 stars is always great, because the more that you share your feedback, the easier it will be for the show to be found by more listeners. So I hope you'll take a moment to do that. And as well, you can stop by the blog, womenentrepreneursradio.com, and you can find extended bios of the show guests and articles and announcements of interest to women business owners. So please make sure you stop by the blog and also subscribe to the podcast on your favorite podcast platform. Oh, wait, before you go, you can also stop by dbaileycoach.com to find out more about my nonfiction books and about my online writing courses for fiction authors. And dbaileycoach.com/brightbooks is where you'll find my paranormal and fantasy romance novels. And now, let's get started with the show. Hi everyone, welcome to Women Entrepreneurs Radio with your host, Deborah Bailey, and I'm so glad that you could join us today. So we are going to get started with my guest. Marney Andes is a born-and-bred farm girl from Wallace, Nebraska, a consultant, educator, and entrepreneur. She's dedicated her career to supporting teams and individuals as they develop and grow. Her experience in performance consulting and leadership development spans a wide range of industries, including technology, healthcare, education, and nonprofit. A college basketball player and former Mrs. America, Marney is the founder of Project Aspire, a nonprofit created to support women in the pursuit of higher education and leadership opportunity. And Marney holds a master's in Information and Learning Technologies from the University of Colorado, Denver, and currently resides outside of Denver with her husband, Alan, and her 2 sons, Owen and Brody. So welcome to the show, Marney. Really great to have you here.
Yeah, thanks, Deb. Thanks so much for inviting me.
So usually I get started with asking the guests how you got started in the work that you do. And I think that is a great way for us to start, because that's also going to tie in later when we talk a little bit about your book. So
right.
If you could share that, that'd be wonderful.
Yeah. Well, I think about my upbringing had a lot to do with how I started to get into the work that eventually led to me writing a book. And that is really coming from a family who were either farmers or educators, or combine that in some way, shape, or form. And so you can look at my family and see my grandmother was an educator. My mom was an educator. Both of my aunts, well, actually all 3 of my aunts were educators. It's just really interesting. I have cousins that went into education as well. And so it was sort of within us that if we weren't on the farm, we were actually really involved with the communities and wanting to give back and teach children. And so I did that as well. I graduated with an undergraduate degree with secondary education. I taught in middle school and high school for a few years. But when I thought back to a lot of different experiences in my life, there was always some sort of teaching and education component to all of that. When I was involved with multiple things through high school, I always took a role of sort of thinking around how I might be training others or helping them develop and coaching, and obviously played that role within sports and athletics in my life too. And then, went on to college and, rushed a sorority, and I hadn't even thought about this, but I was the fraternity educator my senior year. And I've always looked back and said there's this woven thread throughout my life of just wanting to teach and help people grow and develop. And so I was able to then think about, well, would I want to stay teaching middle school and high school, and decided I wanted to go get my master's degree and hopefully parlay that into doing that in a corporate environment. So think about how would I develop adults and teach other adults how to develop or how to, learn a new skill or whatever that might be. And did that throughout most of my career. Even when I was consulting, many times I would be brought in by an organization saying, we need to do more learning or we need to do more development for our employees. And that might turn into an engagement around new hire onboarding, or that might turn into an executive coaching arrangement, and a number of things that I've done. And most recently I've been in healthcare and have played a role around talent development, talent management, teammate experience, and have really found a place in healthcare, because for me to be able to educate and support the teammates that provide such incredible care to patients, to us, to you and I, to people we care about, that matters a lot to me. So it wasn't just doing the work itself. It was where I was doing the work, which led me to learning a lot around myself, what I believed in, how I thought was the right environment, and what was conducive to helping people develop and grow within an organization. And that really led to me finally deciding to take a lot of my experiences and stories and things that I was doing with others, with whether it be teams I was leading or other leaders I was working with, and start to put some of that practically into a book that I could continue to use with people when I was working with them, but then also just share it with people that maybe wouldn't have known me or wouldn't have an experience working with me, that these were lessons I felt were universal, that people could apply these not only in their professional setting, but also in their personal lives, which we'll get into what those lessons are, but that's really what's led me to where I'm at today.
Wow. That's quite the journey also.
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of times people don't realize that what they've learned and what they've experienced can be so helpful in other parts of their life, and also be helpful to other people who they interact with.
Right. I mean, when I think of holistically all the lessons that I put together in my book, it really was from a place that a lot of these lessons sit within us. We already have the lessons. We may have forgotten them. Maybe we haven't even taken the time to identify how we've practiced something that maybe we learned when we were only 12 years old. But that was a really incredible experience for me to, one, acknowledge that these were lessons that have always been sitting with me. A lot of them were they were like sayings. But when I really peeled them back, it wasn't just a statement that I was using. These were lessons that, while I had the very specific story growing up with them, these were things I applied in my life. These were things that were almost core values for me. And I do believe that we all have those. They might be different flavors of even what I've put in my book. They might be beyond that. In some cases, different. And learn from different people in our lives. But I do feel like we have those. It just takes time and some reflection and some intentionality to be reminded of what those are, and then to tap into those and say, well, how could I glean something now where I'm at? And why does that matter now? Or why does that apply still to my life today? And I do take readers through that journey toward the end of my book when they see how it's all laid out. But I really do believe that. And that's why I believe that while these may be the lessons I learned and how I'm sharing, really the lesson of all of those together is that we all have these that we should be sharing with one another. Just like your podcast, you're sharing ideas and you're sharing with your listeners who may be trying to navigate something right now. And I think we all have something to offer in that realm, even though many times we might say, I'm trying to learn from other people. I want to hear what they've done, but we each have something we can offer too.
When I started this podcast, I wanted to connect with other people who were working for themselves, because I had started freelancing and I didn't know anybody else who was doing that. So that was my way to say, well, who else is out here? Because I had no idea. So you're right. You never know when you're starting something or you're sharing your ideas or sharing your experiences. I think there's always a benefit for someone to hear that and then realize that they have something they can share, or they realize they're not by themselves.
Right.
In what they're doing. They may not even know, because maybe the people around them aren't really in that world or thinking in that same way, Right. So what really inspired you to say, I'm going to sit down and write this book?
It was for a couple of reasons. One was the 8 lessons that I highlight in my book are all lessons that I learned from my dad, my late dad. So I lost my dad in 2012, and I had actually thought about, before he even passed away, that there were so many lessons that I had used from him in other parts of my life. And I really thought, here was an opportunity. I had waited. He was already gone, but these lessons still sat with me. And this was such a great way for me to help, bring his legacy forward, to help share what I learned from him with other people around me. Mm-hmm. And the second part of that, which is obviously related, is I was using it in my work. I was using it in my everyday life. And there was really like a point that I, kind of had to say to myself, if you took the time to finally write all this stuff down and articulate it in a way that you could make sense of it and more easily share it with others, how much more impact could I personally have in the work that I was doing or the relationships that I was having in my life? And so it became one part practical and the other part really just out of love, to be able to honor my father and to be able to do this together. And so it's really been a beautiful experience in doing that. It was a hard experience. I know you are an author, so you know what it takes to be able to put all that together. And so it was both challenging, but it was also really rewarding, because there were certain parts that I had in some cases forgotten about. And so when I was really pressed to say, like, well, what was it about that story, or why was that so important? It really forced me to do the work, which I'm so grateful for, because now I'm benefiting in my own work. Certainly when I now share it with other people, they can actually take it and do something with it. Whereas before it might have been me just sharing some random advice, or, hey, this is how I remember my dad saying it, or here's why that matters. Now I'm like, here's what it is. Here's how I've used it. Here's how I've been successful or not successful with it. Here's how I think you can use it. And oh, by the way, here's some guiding questions to help you really think through each of these lessons so that you have sort of like a takeaway with each.
Mm. Well, that's true, because having it as a book, then it can even be shared with people who you may not personally come in contact with, but someone buys this and they share it with other people. So these kinds of things could go very far beyond, what our original thoughts were when we're thinking of writing things down. Right. So what are some of the, I guess the strongest lessons that you started with when you started to work on your book?
Well, it was interesting. I really sort of took statements that I recalled sharing with other people really naturally. And the one that ended up being the title of my book, Start with the Give Me Shots, is actually lesson number 2. And I just couldn't get away from it. Like every time my publisher and I would try to sit down and try to figure out what the right title would be, I just kept coming back to Start with the Give Me Shots, which really sets the stage, because it was I could see everything. I could hear it. I could smell it. I remember being in that moment. And it was this lesson that really was driven out of athletics, and specifically basketball. And it was, born out of a story where I remember it was one fall afternoon when I was in high school, and I had gone out onto our driveway on the farm. And I was just shooting the basketball randomly, just, heaving shots from all over the court, making only a few of them. And I remember my dad, who was at the far end of the farm near our far pens, feeding the cattle, because in addition to farming corn and wheat, I mean, that's like traditional Nebraska. Like, even if you haven't been to Nebraska, you're like, I think of corn and I think of wheat. But we also raised purebred Angus cattle. And my dad was down by the far pens feeding the cattle, and I was up doing this, and I could hear him from like 100 yards away yelling at me, Marn, start with the give me shots. And I had heard this from him, I don't know how many times, to the point where even at that point as a child, it was embarrassing for me that my dad had to yell up to me and remind me of that. And I remember before I could even sort of get my bearings straight. There was my dad walking straight up toward me onto the driveway, takes the ball out of my hands and said, you have to start with give me shots. And what the give me shots were to my dad they were the baskets that were really close to the hoop. So 2 feet off of both sides and at the front of the rim. And what he really believed was that if players spent more time and invested more time in shooting the give me shots, those closest to the basket, and did that every single day, they would hone not only their best shot, they would most likely make those shots when challenged by defenders, but then they would be so ingrained with the motion of that shot that as they moved out farther from the basket, those shots wouldn't be hard either because they would have been practicing this whole time. And I think this lesson, although I would argue all the lessons are very applicable, regardless of in a personal setting or a professional setting, I've shared this story with friends. I've shared this story with peers, my own teams that I've led, and I've shared this with CEOs and executive teams when defining why we should focus on certain things for our strategic direction and why fundamentals and foundational skills matter. And the way that I share that is, even though my dad was talking about basketball, and I was very successful athletically, without a doubt, that lesson really stuck with me. But beyond basketball, what I took from that was really practice the things that you do well already. So people talk about, really feed into your strengths. I absolutely believe that. I know people also talk about, I want to get better at something I'm weaker at. I don't discredit that. I think we should all work on things that we have passion around getting better at. But what I found is when you really zone in on those things that are uniquely you, that you are really, really good at, too many times we tend to say, oh, I don't need to practice those things because I'm good at those things. And potentially, you might even look around all of your peer group and say, I'm the best at those things. Maybe I don't have to work on those. But I would argue that's more of the reason why you need to practice those every single day. And when you think about people that are, your listeners that might be saying, I'm trying to navigate, where I should put my energy, or I like what I'm doing, but I'd like to do more, or I like what I'm doing, but I'd like to run my own business doing that same thing instead of working for someone else. And I think it's a great lesson to really tap into that is, what do you already do really well? What makes you uniquely you? And not only do you know what those things are, but are you practicing them every day? And that's what I would encourage people to do, because if you do that, I feel like so much more comes back to you. You're able to really, really elevate and accelerate where you can really achieve success if you focus on those things that you do well, but only if you practice them and only if you put intentional time into them every single day. So that's one example of the lessons. I don't know that it's the most powerful, but I think it's incredibly, related to this. Mm-hmm. The other lesson, which I haven't actually talked a ton about in forums like this, but you mentioned it when you were exploring, wanting to run your own business or think around that. I have another lesson in the book that's called Know the Rules of the Game. And you actually prompted me to that because you were sharing that you asked other people that had done this, like, how did you do it? Because I want to do it, because not a lot of people around you knew enough about it, right? And that's really the premise of the lesson, which is, I always tell people you can do anything. I really believe it if you just know the rules of the game. So if the game is, I'm going to start my own business, don't just go by chance. I mean, people don't wake up and start their own businesses. I always think that sometimes we have people that maybe sit with they've been in an employment situation and they always look at those people that maybe leave and start their own business and think, gosh, how lucky those people must be. Mm-hmm. And I always tell people that's not luck. It's because those people put in the time and the effort, but they also understood what they had to do to start that business. And so it doesn't mean you can't start a business. It means you got to surround yourself with the people that know how to do it. So know the rules, know someone who's an expert in it, research it, learn what it takes to do it, and then start surrounding yourself with those people. Buy them coffee, go learn from them. I mean, all the things I bet you did. I would love to hear how you learn some of the rules of the entrepreneurial game, because I think that's absolutely what that lesson taps into.
Yes, actually. And I did similar things, networking and going to groups that other business people were at and just kind of reading books, anything to get a feel for what was this other world that people were in, because it was such a transition between one and the other. So you really had to kind of figure it out and see where you fit into this, but also to understand it. And you're right, understand what the rules are to it, because it is different when you're coming from being employed in a corporation, particularly. It's a totally different world, it feels like, anyway, when you step into it.
Right.
So, yeah.
Well, you take the mystery out of it too. So it's not only do I learn how to do it, but it becomes more achievable because now I've learned more about it. I learned how someone else maybe struggled to get through it. I've learned, where maybe, what I find is when you really start to ask people to talk about their experiences, people love to talk about what worked for them and what didn't work for them. I have yet to meet somebody that's like, I don't want to tell you that because that's, that's too secretive. I wouldn't want you to know that. Right. I mean, most people are like, don't do this. If I had it to do again, I would do this. And so, I think like there's a perfect example of people want to pay forward lessons. You learn those lessons along the way. And so really it's a matter of just saying like, I'm going to invest the time. I'm going to learn the rules. I'm going to understand what it takes to do this. And by doing that, it becomes less scary. It becomes way more possible.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I totally agree with that, because I also remember meeting someone who I used to work with as a contractor in a telecom company that used to be here, and I had my assignment had ended, so then I left, and then she got hired, but then they had layoffs of some of the tech writers, so she was relocating. And we met for lunch and she had questions about, well, what do you do? How do you get started if you want to freelance and that kind of thing? So I thought that was very interesting, because I remember being at a stage where I didn't know. And I was like, well, what do you do? What do you know? And now you have some experiences, good and bad, that now you can have someone else who's asking you, well, look at this, think about that, consider that, you can share that with them to help them now to decide what they're going to do. And I think that's the thing for people to realize, that what they've experienced is important. Not to think that, if I'm not the huge success that they think they're supposed to be, that doesn't count, but all of it counts.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. I had a similar experience when I started my nonprofit. I really just started out with a goal that when I went through graduate school, really the only way to get the ability to pay for it through scholarships or otherwise was to apply for graduate assistantships, which I found was very fortunate that I was able to interview for that. I actually talk about that story in the book too, that I was able to interview and get that. And the majority of my tuition was paid for because I had a graduate assistantship in that. And what I found out though after school was, while working for a proprietary college and recruiting people into it, I was seeing a lot of really talented women, really smart women who had either started families right away or decided to go into the workforce right away and now had decided to come back to school, but they were making just enough money to not qualify for loans or whatnot. And quite frankly, really didn't want to even entertain that. But they were also really, really smart people that quite frankly, I just saw them and I was like, gosh, if we could get more women like you educated with higher education degrees and possibly taking on leadership roles, how incredible would that be? So when I started my nonprofit, it was, how can I raise money to give back to local colleges and universities for women who were seeking higher education degrees? It was that simple. How could I just raise money and start turning that over into scholarships? And I remember when I would tell people about my vision, they were like, so what's the name of the organization? And so I was kind of playing around with names at the time. And they're like, so, what's your typical donation? I said, well, I mean, honestly, anything and everything matters. And I basically collect enough. And then when I think it's enough of a scholarship, which most of it was like, if I had $1,000, then I would turn that into a scholarship. I would, meet with a local college or university. And I remember one of my friends early on, they'd said, well, no, but I'm asking like, how much could I give you? And I said, well, how much do you have? And he said, he opens up his wallet. He goes, I have $5 on me. I go, I'll take it. And because, right, like because that was the point. The business was, I was raising money and I was turning it into scholarships. So I was starting out doing what I knew. I was passionate. I had a vision. I knew what I wanted it to do. It was then over time, I started enlisting experts. I started asking somebody who'd created a board of advisors, and how do you get 501c3 status? And how do I do all these things that are going to be really helping me elevate this organization? But I started somewhere. And that's what I think is when people hear about the organization now, it's like, wow, it's this incredible. No, you have to understand. I was like hitting everybody up I knew for like $1 to $5 at a time. And then I was turning it into scholarships, but that's how so many people start. And I think it's too often that's what's just sort of, we just flash over that really quick. Like, oh, I didn't even think about that. Yeah. That's how you get started. So you ask questions like that.
That's a great example, because again, a lot of times someone may not start because they think, oh, I don't have all the information. And people get paralyzed because they just figure it has to all be perfect and lined up before they can make one move. And, a lot of times a lot of ideas kind of shrivel up because they're always waiting for that one time that they can finally do it.
Right.
So this is such a great story because you didn't wait for that.
No. Well, it's like experimentation. I tell everybody in work, when I'm leading teams, to my personal life, I just think this is all one big experiment. So if we kind of go back to like our 7th grade science class where we were, maybe putting stuff in beakers and blowing up stuff. Maybe that was just my experience in science class. Cause I was always trying to figure out like, what could I put into place that would like, foam or smoke or whatever. But, I really think that's if people really saw it as, this is test ground. This is an opportunity for me to experiment. And the worst case scenario is that it doesn't turn into something. The worst case scenario is I try something and either that's not something that fits a need or people aren't really understanding it. But even during that experiment, you could craft your story better because you realize that people are like, oh, if you explain it like that, that makes sense to me. Or, you might, again, have some really great advisors that want to help you, or you might be able to ask the right questions. But, I think there's something that we can learn about just treating this life and these experiences like experiments, not looking for perfection, but being willing to try and test and see where things go. And then as you learn, of course, crafting that into what would be not only helpful for others, because that's why you're trying to do something, but then how does that help you lead a business or do something on your own so that you wouldn't have to be working full time somewhere else. So I think there's a lot of opportunity in that.
Yeah. And I think that's a great idea also as far as looking at things as experiments, because I don't think we always get that lesson. As adults, maybe as kids, maybe you have more of that leeway, but as adults, we always have the sense that everything must work.
Right.
If it doesn't, what did we do wrong or we're terrible? That didn't work the way we thought. But looking at it as an experiment is really pretty freeing.
Yeah. Oh, very much so. It took me a while to get to that point, but I think if there's a lesson I would like to pay forward. I hope people hear that early on. I wish my younger self, I wish I would have done that. Cause I think for too much of my life, I thought I had to perfect something before I could talk about it or share my ideas around it. And what I found is, and why I encourage my teams to do this now too, is too many times it's we get paralyzed by waiting too long to craft something that then potentially the time's passed. So if we're in this safe space where it's like, no, we have something that's enough of the way, we experiment, we test it, we try to get feedback on it, and then we continue pushing forward based on what we learn from that. I mean, gosh, I think about doing that in so many other parts of my life. I mean, most of it, I wish there was a handbook for it, but there's not. There's not a handbook to how do you own a home, or there's not a handbook to how do you decide whether renting or owning a home. There's not a handbook around raising kids or raising animals, or I wish so much of all of that is experimentation. So I feel like we have that opportunity to do that in all parts of our life, whether that's starting a new business or exploring something that we've been doing for 10 years and we want to rethink how we've been doing it.
That's great advice, actually. Something I'm sure people would benefit from if they can kind of work with themselves to look at it that way and not beat themselves up if there's not perfection there. But so what were your experiences with the pageant? How did that help you, or what did you learn from that?
Right. Well, when I competed as Mrs. Colorado, I think at the time when I did it, it was just really to sort of get back into, getting back into mental shape, physical shape. My son was about a year and a half. Actually, my son was less than a year old when I competed the first year. I won my second year of competing at Mrs. Colorado and then went on to assume the title of Mrs. America. For me, it was never about competing with other people. It was really about competing with myself. And there's actually really interesting parts of the competition. So for face value, you might look at it and go, oh, that's a beauty pageant, but there's components of it. So of course there's a physical fitness component where there's a swimsuit competition. There's obviously an evening gown. So it's sort of like the beauty pageantry part of it. But for me, there was also this interview piece of it. And I really felt like even though I was working and doing certain things, that I really wanted to sort of have this platform where it was me just speaking. And so the interview process in a pageant sort of allowed for that. It wasn't me interviewing for a job of, being an instructional designer or a facilitator. It was me sort of interviewing as like who I was and what I cared about and what I believed in and what I wanted to, continue doing in my life. And so I felt like I needed that in my life, and that I had learned through competing in a pageant before that this was a forum by which I could do that. But it just sort of brought all those pieces together. And there was a part of me, it's really interesting. I can compare it and connect it to when I was actually competing in athletics growing up. So I had been in sports my whole life. I had competed in basketball, volleyball. I ran track in high school. And then I went on to get a full ride basketball scholarship, but I only played 1 year. I had a really, really not great experience with the coach there and just the whole atmosphere, how I was coming off of my high school coach and experience as well, which I do not go into in the book, and we're not going to go into it now. But I will say that when I decided to stop playing, there was about a decade of time there between that and when I competed in the pageant that I really felt like I had lost myself. I felt like I had quit something, and that suddenly this identity of being an athlete and I don't know, sort of being at the top of my game had, left my life. And so there was a little bit of the pageant somehow brought that back. There was that physical piece where I had to work out to do the physical competition. So there I was back in that athletic mode. Again, I wasn't competing against the other women that were competing. I was trying to be the best version of me. Well, even though you played in a team sport, basketball or volleyball, you still were working on your own game as well. So there was just all these really interesting components for me. Now, not everybody gets that out of working in a pageant. Some people come back because they're celebrating the fact that they, had some major life milestone that they want to celebrate. There's a lot of different reasons why women come to it, but that's what it did for me. And I've talked at length about, what stereotypes and how people might look at pageants. And actually I've heard, more around, was it relevant? And should we reconsider how, why pageants? Oh my gosh. If we have to do this on every single thing, it's either you want to be in it and you want to watch it or you don't. It would be like anything. I'm not asking to revamp, the Tough Mudder or the Iron Man. Let it be what it is. people want to do that. I don't want to go through ice cold water and get electrocuted, but hey, if that's your jam, go do it. but I do think there's things like that where you kind of go, whether it's a pageant or it's another experience, if it's being part of a book club, if it's going to attend this networking event, I really just think people need to think about where else can they get experiences to learn and grow. And at the end of the day, I needed that experience to be reminded of how I felt, but it also helped me learn and grow, because I don't believe some of the stories and some of the things that I've shared with people, whether it be public speaking or some of the things that, that found their way into my book, I don't know that I would have had that had I not gone through that pageant experience. So it definitely played a specific role in my life, and I'm very grateful for it.
Mm-hmm. That's a great point, because your preparation that you went through is a part of your growth and all of that. And you can bring those experiences to other parts of your life. So that's the thing to look at, I think. But, yeah.
Yeah. Well, and you don't identify those if you don't take time, to really reflect on what it is that you want, or where you've been, where you are, where you want to go. And the last lesson in my book, which I think is, maybe it is the most powerful. I don't know, Deb, but it's the only lesson that my dad said in a form of a question. So the other two lessons, it was start with give me shots, Marn. You just got to know the rules of the game, Marn. This one was, what have you done for the community today? And my dad, probably the last 10 years of his life, would ask me that question almost every day when I drove home from work. Cause almost every day when I drove home from work, I called him just to see how he was doing. And we just sort of check in with one another. And he'd ask that question of me, but he also asked it of other people. And the question many times would prompt something like, well, I don't know. I mean, I'm working on this project. There's some good stuff going. I'm pretty pleased with the way things are going. And, we continue talking about it. And some days I probably just unleash on him. Like, I can't believe, all this thing, it's a mess and these things are happening and I'm not really sure if I'm, in the right place. And then there might be days where I'd share, I just don't even know if there was much of anything to share with you today. And my dad would always prompt more. Hey, there's something we always do for the good of the community. And really what he meant by that, which I don't know that he knew this, but this is how I've interpreted the lesson that I share with readers, is this isn't about philanthropy. This isn't about, necessarily giving back to the community financially or your time. Although my dad was a very generous person, I obviously believe in it by starting my own nonprofit, and I give to other charities and my time and resources. But really the gift that he gave me was thinking about the good that I do for myself every day. Like, what is it that I was doing? Because if I'm really clear on that and I take the time to reflect on that and I do something with that information, I am actually contributing to the community in a really positive way. And so I think about it as a lesson of reflection. It's taking the time every day, in some cases, to take inventory, like what happened today or what didn't happen today that I wish did. And so I've really put it into sort of 3 simple questions that I ask myself at the end of every day, that this question sparked me to think about, which was, what happened today? What do I think or feel about it? And what, if anything, do I want to do about it? And I share that because just even sharing the experience of the pageant, or when people are trying to think about, I want to start my own business or I want to do all these things, it is really hard, in my opinion, to see those things or identify that you might want to do that if you don't take time every day for reflection. And it doesn't have to be, extensive journaling, or it doesn't have to be this really deep meditation. It can be, but I always tell people, I think we're so busy with the noise that's around us. It's too many times it's just like when you say you could drive somewhere and you've driven a couple miles and you're like, well, that's freaky because I don't really even remember going this far. Look at your life. Have you gone day over day doing the same thing, or just being busy all the time that you haven't even had a chance to step back and go, okay, what even happened today? Or what even happened this week? And And do I like it? You know,
Mm-hmm.
do I want more of that? Have I actually taken time to be grateful for the things that I have really enjoyed? Have I taken time to recognize that there's something that keeps showing up every single day that's not fun? I don't like it. It's been happening for far too long, and I got to decide if I want to do something about it. And so, you know, I think it can lead to huge change. It can lead to just going, I like that. I'm just going to keep doing that. But all of that is incredibly beneficial to us, but it requires us to stop, take a moment, and evaluate what it is that we want to do. And if there's probably anything that got me writing the book, it was that lesson right there. And I had the pandemic hit, and I realized, you know, here I was working from home, and suddenly I'm sitting there going, you know, I've talked about writing a book, and well, why can't I get up at 5 a.m. and start writing some ideas? Or why, you know, there really wasn't a good enough excuse to say I shouldn't do it. So it was kind of like, it's time. And not to say it's going to lead everybody to read a book, but it might lead that person that said, I've been in this job for 10 years. I don't like it. I actually want to go do something different. Now I'm going to start taking the steps to do it.
That's true. And that's a great reason for you to start, because you had something to say and you have something to share, with someone else who may be looking for those lessons, or looking for something that they can really learn from and benefit from, and realize what they can do.
Right.
That's important. And, you know, putting a book out there is not an easy task, no matter what anybody may think. It takes a lot of commitment and drive and desire to do that. So that's a wonderful accomplishment. And like I said, books are out there and they can travel, you know, the places that we can't. And you never know who's picking that book up and where they are, you know, geographically, or where they are in their life and what they're going to get from that. So I think that's really the great thing about books. You know, there's lessons there that are always going to be there for someone to pick up at some point. That's pretty exciting. So, why don't you share with everyone where they can find out more about you and they can find your book?
Well, you can find my book on Amazon. So our listeners can either search for Start with the Give Me Shots, or they can search for Marney Andes' book, and you'll find it on Amazon. And they can also find me at marneyandes.com. I have continued to write even after publishing the book in March of 2021. And I usually put out a new blog article every week, and I'm very active on LinkedIn, so they can connect with me there. And I'm, you know, experimenting, because I like that word. I'm experimenting with Instagram, and so they can also connect with me there. It's been an interesting social media platform for me, but there's a number of ways to connect. And if they do connect with me on the website, I really think there is a power of a community that's just sharing lessons. And I'm not quite sure what that's going to look like long term, but I am trying to formulate some ideas, forums, how people can connect and share stories like this, for no other reason than paying it forward and for us to hear how we've each used our lessons throughout our life. I think there's something there. So I'm experimenting with that too. So I'd invite your listeners to connect with me in any of those places.
That's great. Cause I think, I don't know. I think originally that's what some people may have thought social media was supposed to be. I'm not sure what it is now, but
right. Right. I haven't figured out the rules of that game yet. So I am still trying to figure that out.
Yeah, I'm not sure if it's turned into something else entirely, but, you know, just for people to share, I think in a positive way, in a healthy way for them to learn is right. Something that we definitely need more of, because we don't always have that.
Agreed.
You know, so I think that's a great idea. Something that you're working on. So hopefully that's something we will hear about at some point. Yeah. At some point soon, because I think we could all benefit from things like that. So, you know, Marney, usually, I will ask people what what final thoughts or other thoughts that they'd like to share or summarize that maybe they haven't mentioned, or, something in particular you think you'd like the listeners to really take away from this conversation?
One other thing that I think would be really, good for your listeners, especially with the nature of the podcast that you have and you host. There's another lesson in my book that talks about the concept of working while others are on break. And what I've shared with people is that a lot of times I think we can want to pursue all these things, and we can have these incredible ambitions to do more and think that that means we need to pile on more, and that we need to have more stress, or we have to have this pain before we can feel the pleasure of whatever it is that we're trying to work toward. And I help people think through how to navigate that, less of a just more and more around how do you make trade-offs, and how do you think about the trade-offs and communicate the trade-offs in your life. And that there is this aspect of when you want to develop something of your own, when you want to have that entrepreneurial piece in your life, that you will have to work when other people might be quote unquote taking a break, but it doesn't mean it's forever, and it shouldn't feel like that. In fact, what I think people really need to focus in on is doing the right stuff and spending the right time in the right places. And I think if there's anything that many people might look at this and say, oh, it just means I have to do more. It's not. There's a way for you to navigate that. And I think there's a lot of, lessons to be learned that I've shared already, but I think that's one that maybe people don't really hear. Certainly you put in a finite amount of time of working very, very hard to do the things, just like you and I've talked about it. It doesn't magically happen overnight. Mm-hmm. But just to think you do more and all that stuff happens, I don't think that's the right message either. And so I think there's this balance, which is why collectively the 8 lessons that I've put together, I think really kind of provide that balance. So that would be another thing to share with your listeners. But I have to say, even your background, I think is really interesting. The fact that, to have a career in IT, to turn that into, technical writing, to also then think about, English major and turning that into an author yourself. I think hearing all the different ways in which people have migrated and navigated this is actually really, really important. And so regardless of education or regardless of the path, if it looks unique and people are wondering, well, it doesn't look like somebody else that's done this before, I actually think that's a good thing. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think you have a unique path. My unique path from coming from being a teacher in middle school and high school, and then eventually now, leading teams and thinking around helping to do talent development and coaching within organizations. I never would have thought about doing that 25 years ago. Our unique paths matter. And I think, your listeners, whatever you're navigating right now or whatever path you've been on, the uniqueness of your path matters. And so tap into that, tap into some of the lessons we've shared today, and tap into your network, to begin exploring what it is that you're wanting to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's so important. Because then people realize that all their experiences are important. They've learned something from them, because, sometimes you think, well, I did this and I did that, and where am I heading and where am I going? What does it all mean? And then you find at some point, wow, because I learned this here, or I learned that over there, I went through this. You have this body of knowledge and experience that helps you when maybe you're trying new things, like you said, or experimenting, because you've done these different things, you may not have that same fear of trying this thing and seeing how that works out. So that's really important. And I think particularly for people starting a business or thinking of one, it's good for them to hear that they can do something different and new, and not feel that, oh, I can't, for the variety of reasons we tell ourselves. So,
right.
Yeah. I think that's wonderful to share with everyone, and I know they are certainly going to appreciate that, because I know I do. So, It's always good to have all this reinforced, I think, no matter where you are in your journey. So, Marney, I was really happy to have you join me today and share your lessons and about your book and everything. I just want to thank you for this conversation. I really enjoyed it.
You're welcome. And thank you, Deb, for having me.
All right. So everyone, I know you enjoyed the show. Please make sure that you share this on social media, and you can listen and contact Marney and get her book and see what she's up to. And like I said, please make sure to share this with others you think could benefit from what we've talked about today. So once again, to Women Entrepreneurs Radio with your host, Deborah Bailey. Thanks for joining us, and we will see you again next time. Bye-bye.
Thanks for joining us. Don't forget to stop by womenentrepreneursradio.com to read extended bios of the show guests, and also find links there for their websites and any offers that they have shared with you. And stop by our Facebook page at facebook.com/womenentrepreneurs.